Welcome to Into Theology. I'm joined with Ian Clary, and we're looking at Book 9 of Augustine's Confessions. This is kind of the end of the how we think of a story ought to be. It's he's baptized, his mother passes away, although she's able to see him as a baptized Christian. Her prayers and hopes and dreams for him are fulfilled, and then he really begins almost like it's like the beginning of a new life for him, where all the exciting things that we know about Augustine finally begin to happen. And I know you had you wanted to open by reading, I think, the first paragraph of chapter 9, right? Or book 9,
yeah,
rather.
First two paragraphs of book 9, really, because it really does set the stage for everything he's going to talk about now in this book. So he's just had this like profound conversion experience in the garden in Milan. He's hanging out with
I'm reading. Sorry, I have this mum mug, which is like kind of perfect timing for this thing about Augustine's mum. I just noticed that's in the camera as I was drinking.
Weird. That's hilarious.
Anyway, sorry, go on.
Oh, it's all good. Yeah, so he's had his conversion experience, obviously very monumental for him, momentous for him. And so, some scholars have asked the question, like, why doesn't he just end Confessions at the end of book 8? He's saved now. It's kind of like the climax. And I think that what he's telling us here, a few things. One is that, as you alluded to, conversion is not like the end of the story. It's actually kind of the beginning or the new beginning of it. And then like he's bringing closure to his mom's story that's kind of been peppered throughout. She sees him baptized, and her grandson she gets to see baptized too, Adeodatus, which is pretty cool. Are you frozen?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, you're back.
Okay.
Yeah. Was I still talking?
Yeah, you were still talking. It was all, the recording was fine on my end, so it must have been just some weird glitch.
Oh, it's like it says my internet connection is unstable. Anyway. So he's gone through all this, and now he's telling us, her story. And then he's talking about baptism, because baptism is, like, we forget that, like, in the early church, like, baptism and conversion are intimately tied to each other, right? And so it would be very weird for an early Christian reader to have his conversion experience and then no baptism. And so baptism is going to be very important here. All right, so I'm going to read from book 9. I'll just read these opening 2 paragraphs. O Lord, I am your servant. I am your servant and the son of your handmaid. You have torn away my bonds, and I will offer you a sacrifice of praise. Let my heart and my tongue praise you, and let all my bones declare, Lord, who is like you? Let them declare it, then answer me and say to my soul, I am your salvation. Who am I, and what kind of being am I? What was there that was not evil in my actions? Or if not my actions, then my words, or if not my words, then my will. But you, Lord, are good and merciful. Your right hand encountered the depth of my death. It drained the pit of corruption from the ground of my heart. This was all there was to it, to stop wanting what I wanted and to start wanting what you wanted. But after such a span of years, where was my free will? And from what depth and from what place of utter secrecy was it called forth at that moment to enable me to submit my neck to your gentle yoke and my shoulders to your easy burden, O Christ Jesus, my help and my Redeemer? How suddenly it became my delight to do without the delights of trivialities. Now it was my joy to repudiate what I had once feared to relinquish. For it was you who cast them away from me, and you are the greatest true delight. You cast them away, and in their place you entered sweeter than every sensual pleasure, but not to flesh and blood, more radiant than any light, but hidden deeper than any mystery, more sublime than any prestige, those who count themselves sublime. At last, my mind was free from the gnawing anxieties of ambition and acquisition and of scratching the itch of physical desire and wallowing in it. And I started to pour out my thoughts to you, my illumination, my riches, and my salvation, O Lord my God. So it's an interesting contrast, right, to everything he's been saying so far in the book that really culminates in book 8 with his conversion. He talks about being able to like put away those those delights of trivialities. If you remember when he's in the garden, he's like, these things are gnawing at the robe of my flesh. And he says, but they're mere trifles and I couldn't get past them. Now they're gone. He's got all these ambitions. They're all met for him. He gets the teaching job he wants. He's in Rome and Milan. He's like addressing the emperor. And he's saying, basically, God, now you got rid of all these ambitions. I don't want them anymore. I don't want to want what I want. I want to want what you want. So what he's trying to do is like orient his desires now in accordance with God's. And he's basically kind of showing like a reordered soul, where he is He's getting rid of those physical desires in order to orient himself towards the good, which is God. And so it's like not only does this introduce book 9 so well for us, but it's like it marks the entire contrast now to everything that he'd been discussing in the first 8 books. So it's pretty important.
I think it's just, as a quick side note, interesting too, that the way he talks about freedom, the freedom of the will is different than we might, because he's basically arguing he wasn't free. His free will was actually hidden.
Yeah.
Largely, I think the implication is because he was controlled by his lusts, self-indulgence, and all the things that he mentions.
Yeah.
Really only free when he can, as you noted, order his soul properly. So he's making just choices that are reasonable and good. But he's unfree, even though he can choose whatever he wants in terms of like contrary choice. He can't find his free will.
Yeah, it's like the classic distinction that he'll make, with different types of free will, where like in Adam and Eve in the garden have perfect free will, they're morally upright, nothing's compelling them one way or the other. Then after the fall, they're still able to sin, but then they're not able not to sin. And then you get converted, and then you're back in this place where you can like choose to sin or choose not to. And then you go to glory, where you can only do that which is righteous, but in all stages, you still have free will, but you're going to choose according to those desires. And if those desires aren't oriented towards the good, then you'll either always choose one thing or always choose another. So it's free yet bound.
Now do it in Latin.
Yeah, the whole passe picare kind of stuff that I first heard of from R.C. Sproul, 20 something years ago, and it still sits with you.
And R.C. was a good teacher.
Yeah.
He really you might have disagreements or anything, but he's just a good teacher.
Yeah, that was his genius for sure.
Well, one thing I'm just noticing now, and it's crazy. I mean, it's obvious in a sense, but this whole thing is the Psalms.
Yeah, the Psalms are everywhere. And
one of the things that Augustine believes, I actually wrote an article for this for some counseling journal on the Psalms. It's like the Holy Spirit gave us the Psalms in order to sort of untwist what's twisted in our soul. And so it's really interesting to me that he had an unfree will because he submitted to lusts and desires, and he gets freedom. And this freedom is then correlated with all these citations of the Psalms, which actually meant to reorder your soul.
Yeah.
That's kind of the purpose the Holy Spirit gave them to us.
Well, we were talking before we recorded about Jason Biassi's book, Praise Seeking Understanding, where it's through Augustine's view of the Psalms. And suddenly it hits you. It's like the Psalms are all pervasive for Augustine. I think we noted it when we were in book 1 of oh, this is just full of the Psalms. As a monk, right, he'd ordered his life according to the Psalter. He would pray the Psalms day in, day out, preaching the Psalms regularly. And so they're
not really a monk for a long time though, right? It's only for a couple of years or something.
Well, I mean, you could say even as a
pastor, okay.
He's a kind of secular monk in a sense.
That makes sense.
Community.
Probably quickly clarify. This time you could either be a monk that goes to a desert or a monk that is in a city and is around people. It wasn't like how we think of the stereotype today. They just go away to some monastery. So you could be in a city and be among 100 people who are part of your society. It's basically like a seminary, and you preach and you do church together and all that kind of stuff.
That's kind of what he does, right? Right after after all this happens, he goes to Cassiquiacum, and it's kind of in a weird way setting up a philosophical yet monastic community. Hold on here. So I'm trying to think. So because there's the difference between the Cenobitic monks, they're the ones who do it in community together, and then the Eremitic monks, which is where we get the word hermit, which is the ones that goes off out into the wilderness by himself.
Yeah, they'd be like Antony the desert, who's already mentioned.
Yeah, right.
And Basil of Caesarea would be like a city monk.
Yeah.
But he's really just a pastor that just likes theology. And
he's
funny, we talk about ivory tower people, or people who are locked in their studies or at the library. That's basically what the monks, these kind of monks, they're they're the nerds.
Yeah.
I want to read just a really cool sentence. It doesn't have a lot, it's not as connected maybe as you're reading, but it's chapter 9 or book 9, chapter 3, section 3.
No, section 2, 3, you mean?
Yeah, I do mean that. You're right.
Yeah.
So he says, "You pierced my heart with the arrow of your love, and we carried your words, transfixing my innermost being," which is a psalm. The examples given by your servants whom you had transformed from black to shining white and from death to life, which we talked about last time.
Yeah.
Crowded in upon my thoughts. They burnt away and destroyed my heavy sluggishness, preventing me from being dragged down to low things. They set me on fire with such force that every breath of opposition from any deceitful tongue, a psalm, had the power not to dampen my zeal, but to inflame it the more. Quick note, we need you need Christian examples. Sometimes you make it sound like all you need to do is like just kind of read the Bible by yourself somewhere, and you don't need the community of Christians who are able to encourage you as the day draws near. But the Bible constantly tells you to look to leaders, to look at people's examples. The whole Old Testament is there for your example. We should moralize the Old Testament like crazy, I think.
Yeah.
All this weird stuff, it can only be like Christocentric, or no, moralize like crazy. It's there. Yeah. It's also there for Christocentric. But for Augustine, it was so important to have these kind of, quote unquote heroes of the faith. Although he doesn't call them heroes, but they are that idea. It inflames them. You need those examples.
This is where too the imagery that you'll often see in portraits of Augustine is he's often got that flaming heart in the image, and that comes directly out of this passage, if I recall.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, where
well,
he's talking
chapter
about
8 has something similar too.
Yeah, it's like his heart is caught fire.
I literally I opened and I think I just found it. Like it was that. So it's chapter 8. So book 8, chapter 4, section 9. It says, "Come, Lord, stir us up and call us back. Kindle and seize us. Be our fire and sweetness.
Yeah.
Let us love, let us return," and so on.
Yeah, so this is like a felt faith. This isn't just propositional. It's not just like arguments or whatever truths, as important as obviously all that's going to be, but it actually does something. Like it inflames the heart, right? So he's like the Puritans here in their experiential piety.
Puritans are great in that area. And for anyone who's tempted to have a propositional Christianity, I think you probably need to read the Psalms.
Yeah.
You need to be like Daniel or David and dance naked before the Lord.
Yeah. Ain't gonna be me.
Your wife might despise you, but
yeah, totally.
You could have a lot of fun. Sorry.
Did you find it funny too, speaking of wives, like when he gets into Verecundus, his buddy, and they go off, they want to start this monastic kind of philosophical community. And so in 3:5, Verecundus was tormented with anxiety about this good that had befallen us, for because of his own bonds, which still tightly constrained him, he could see that he was going to lose our friendship. So like, the bonds must be that he's not saved, and these are his bonds of sin.
But his wife's saved.
Right, but it's like he was not yet a Christian, for his wife, who was a believer, was herself the shackle. It's like, wait, so does the idea of the old ball and chain come out of Augustine's confessions too? Tighter than the rest, which was holding him back from making the journey that he had begun. And so she's holding him back, but it's holding him back because he's this guy with property, and they want to go use it, and she won't let them.
He did not wish to be a Christian except in the way which was not open to him, namely as an ascetic.
Yeah.
So
funny.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really nice about reading history is like you realize that your social norms are not actually the universal norms.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I think there might be some things we could criticize Augustine or even Monica actually on with reference to
he does here, doesn't he?
Well, because she treats earlier in the book his common law partner.
Yeah.
I don't think she has a name.
No, she doesn't. Gary Wills calls her Ina.
Okay. But she kind of forces this woman to leave Augustine, kind of forces them apart.
Yeah.
When probably now we'd say, well, they probably should have married,
Yeah. Pretty a kid. Crazy.
Yeah.
So, but this guy, Verecundus, he eventually gets saved, right? Like deathbed conversion. He gets sick. And while he was ill, he became a Christian and a believer.
And he's the one that owned the estate at Cassiacum, where they could go.
So, it says, your encouragement and consolation show it clearly. True to your promise, you reward Verecundus for that country retreat of his at Cassiacum, where we found rest from the turbulence of daily life and found it in you. And so he eventually does, they use that property for this little kind of community where he writes a number of there's dialogues.
There's roughly there's 4 books that I know of.
Yeah.
One of them's against the scholastics, where he just rails against the medieval scholastics.
No, it's not the scholastics. You idiot. You got me. The skeptics.
And
on track at that.
But then eventually he swims the Tiber.
Gross anachronism there.
And when he swims the Tiber, he pays fealty to the Pope and all his cardinals.
He does swim the Tiber though, right?
Yeah,
he goes back and forth across the Tiber. It's like, what is he, a Protestant?
Okay, but against the skeptics would be against the philosophical skeptics who don't believe much. It's about certainty and truth. I think he has one called
because he himself becomes a skeptic, right? Before he gets saved, before he becomes a Platonist, he's a skeptic, and so now he's repudiating them. And they're the academicos, because that's kind of what happens to Plato's Academy near the end.
He has one on the happy. I'm just looking at it here on the happy life. So how to live. What's the goal of philosophy?
That one is Monica, right? Like Monica is involved.
She's definitely in the conversation, and she surprises him because she says like smart things. He's like, whoa.
Yeah, my mom's smart.
I think he has one called The Teacher, and that might be where he talks to his son.
Yeah, Adiadatus. That's on The Teacher. Yeah, and he actually mentions it near the
in this chapter
in this book. Yeah.
And Augustine's like, he legit is that smart.
Yeah.
Like he's like, my son was a beast.
Yeah. He's like smarter than I ever was. I mean, I actually find that with my kids too. Part of it is the education they're getting is better than what I had when I was a kid. But it's like, oh my goodness, my kid can do algebra. Like I can't. He's like in grade 8 and he's doing algebra. I'm like,
and you could be more interested in educating them than maybe your parents or whatever too. Like that can be part of it. And there's a fourth book, but I can't remember what it is.
What?
The soliloquies. How do you say that word?
Soliloquies. Yeah.
I think I actually have that, but I don't remember. I think it's kind of the most famous one of the bunch, isn't it? But
Yeah, where he's talking to his own soul.
Okay, yeah, these are essentially modeled. All these are modeled after Platonic dialogues, or philosophical dialogues in general. I don't know about Platonic, but there's a group of people that get together and they have a dialogue and they talk through things together.
Yeah, but here he says, it's like, we're specifically talking about you, Lord. He calls himself a catechumen. Remember, he had a problem with his mom before, even a catechumen as a kid, but then they wouldn't let him get baptized when he was like sick. And so here he's talking about himself again in number 8. He says, and here's the Psalms. What cries I uttered to you, my God, while I was reading the Psalms of David, those songs full of faith, sounds of devotion that shut up the proud spirit. So I was clumsy about my love for you, but sincere. I was a catechumen in a country house on holiday with another catechumen, Alypius, which is his friend. And then this great line he has about his mom. My mother was staying with us too. A woman in appearance, she had faith as strong as a man's, and an elderly person's composure, a mother's love, and a Christian's devotion. It's funny how she has manly faith. Oh, here comes somebody smarter than you.
That's right. All right, Pop, let Daddy do a podcast, okay?
She's like, who's that weirdo you're talking to?
She's hiding behind the chair, so I think we're okay.
There you go. He's got the regret about the Manichees, thinks they're ridiculous. I like how he calls about the sacraments. He says, for their ignorance of those sacraments, those therapies for sickness is what he refers to the sacraments as.
Well, for him, a baptized Christian, especially, at least in this context, probably because he's thinking about baptism in context, because he will be baptized here any second. It's hugely important for him. But he talks about baptism in ways that maybe would make us feel uncomfortable. The holy water of baptism, talks about baptism as being like reborn, regeneration by your baptism, all these kinds of words.
Yeah.
But one thing to note, like in the early church especially, is that their language is a little less precise than different than we're used to. Like regeneration for them is like how we think of like the whole spectrum of salvation. It's like all the things that happen in sanctification, or it's like the whole big picture. It's a part of it. Where a lot of times, at least in Baptist circles, we talk about. Sorry, one second.
No, I'm good. It's all good, man. Just go do a workout.
Okay, that's fine. Just gonna go work out. We talk about regeneration as something that precedes baptism, because it's like a more or less a moment of a spiritual awakening. Where even up until the recent period, regeneration's often been used as like the whole part of the Christian life. Like the regeneration of all things is something in the future in the book of Acts, for example. So I just think you're more comfortable when you realize that the language that we use is not the same language that Augustine uses.
I think like what was super helpful for me with like trying to wrestle through this, because there are variations of like what we call baptismal regeneration today. We have to be careful that we don't lump them all in together. Like for some people who say like baptism actually saves you in the sense that it's like the ground of your salvation.
Like you mean Peter? Baptism.
Yeah, like, then Peter does talk about that, right? That's the issue, is like, what does that mean? And like, so David F. Wright's book, Infant Baptism and Historical Perspective, he goes through Augustine's baptism, all that stuff. Super, super helpful. And he explains like, well, the idea of like baptismal regeneration, it's like Augustine gets saved in the Garden of Milan. And he goes to great pains to explain that to us. Like he is saved in the Garden of Milan, yet he's using the language of baptism as like regenerative, only in the sense that the two events are intimately tied. The one precedes the other, obviously. The garden precedes the baptism, so he's saved. But the active like reception of the benefits of salvation that come from the Spirit in a tangible way come through baptism. So baptism is like the way that you can apply that salvation to yourself. Now, like obviously the thief on the cross can't do that, doesn't negate the fact that he's saved. So it's not like baptism is the grounds of one's salvation, but it's so intimately tied that that's how these thinkers, that's why Augustine's like, I was forgiven in baptism, even though he's forgiven in the garden, you know? So, and there, I think there is actually something to that, as long as we're very careful not to make baptism into a work. It's like, it's not just some perfunctory act, like something actually happens.
No, I mean, Augustine will explain this in his book. I think it's called On Christian Doctrine, On Christian Teaching and Doctrine, probably depends on the translation.
Yeah.
He makes the whole point that there's sign and things signified.
Right.
And that the sacrament, basically in the sacrament, there's a sign that's attached to the word.
Yeah. And it's not an empty sign.
It's not an empty sign.
Like,
it
when
actually
you actually undergo the rite, it's like you're appropriating the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think there's a bit more to it. I think sometimes you can read these and just like over theologize or wrongly theologize what's happening with them. So I think that's important.
What do you think of him getting saved and then quitting his job in like 20 days?
So this is really interesting. He has this whole thing where he has to defend himself because he finally gets saved, or I think he's referring probably back to the garden experience.
Yeah.
But he's going on vacation in 20 days, and part of the vacation involves his lungs are damaged, or his voice. I think it's maybe both.
Yeah.
So there's a real reason he needs to go on vacation. So it's not vacation in the modern sense, but like he's going away for a while.
Yeah.
So there's a convenient time for him to kind of do that. But I don't think he wanted to quit right before, because it would
it looks bad.
It would look bad. It would be bad form.
And everybody discussed, and he kind of wants to be private about his conversion, right? It's like, here's this monumentous event, but he doesn't want to go blabbing it, which is something that I kind of appreciate. I think it's an interesting, even just now, it's like everybody's talking now about however you say his name, Shia LaBeouf, or
he's Catholic or something.
Yeah. So he's become a Roman Catholic, right? And everybody's like debating the nature of this, religious change that he's gone through. And, he was such a horrible human being back in the day. Now he's better, whatever. But like, celebrity conversions are kind of an interesting topic. Like Kanye, like this new DJ Khaled album that just dropped, it's got Eminem rapping about like
a Christian lyric, right? I heard someone
Christian lyrics from Eminem. It's like talking positive about the Bible and Jesus, even though he calls Jesus Jesus. But like, it's like, what the heck is going on here? And so like Augustine's an interesting kind of like test case for celebrity conversion. His response is, I'm going to go off for a while. I'm not making a big deal. He could really make hay over, hey, look at me. I've lectured to the emperor. I'm this great rhetorician. Right. And now I'm a Christian.
And he won poetry competitions at the Garland, all that kind of stuff, right?
Exactly. And it's like he goes off to this community, and then his next thing to do is to go back to Africa, back home. This whole conversion's thrown his whole life for a loop. His ambitions are gone.
Well, it's a true conversion, right? It changes his life goals and everything, because he's no longer pursuing the pleasure and advancement and career in the same way.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. He finds a genuine excuse, he says. But they had parents paying him to educate their kids. So there's a lot of money and expectation, and you've already agreed to do something. So he says, look, I spent these 20 days finishing what I needed to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's useful just to remember.
So let's talk about Monica. We should talk about
Monica for the last few minutes here.
Yeah. So obviously Adeodatus dies, and he's pretty devastated by it. This is his son, who has like, it's almost, you can see like his own mother's ambitions for him now he maybe has for his own son. And then very sadly, his son dies. Thankfully, he's undergone the rite of baptism, so he dies as a Christian, which brings him some comfort. But then and he talks about the power of hymns, which is amazing. Both here, he has like a whole discussion of like, these new hymns that are being sung in the context of persecution. Ambrose is writing these hymns to like bring real solace and comfort in the midst of all that. And then he has this long, extended discussion about like his mom. They're on their way back to Africa. They stop in Ostia, which has connections to Virgil and the Aeneid, which is huge for Augustine. And that's where she dies. Like on the way home, she dies, and he's devastated by it, and yet he's trying to like maintain his composure throughout the whole thing. And yet he goes through this kind of like extended, like it's like recollection, almost nostalgia for his mom, and yet she doesn't always come out like the greatest in it either. It's funny, like what a weird way to remember your mom. It's like talking about how she started drinking when she was a kid.
Her servant confronted her because she drank too much from the ladle, right? That's the story.
Yeah.
Why don't we have to finish? Why don't you finish on that kind of that mutual, like she's dying in Ostia and they have this conversation. They're thinking about what life after death will be like. It's kind of one of the cool scene that is maybe like kind of special in a sense that a son and a mother could share this experience.
Yeah.
It's on, I guess chapter 10, sections 23, 24, that area.
Yeah. Where they have like this very famous vision. So like they're in Ostia. He says, we were far away from the crowds, recovering from the stressful long journey, making ready for the onward voyage back to Africa. We were conversing with pleasure, just the two of us, forgetting the past, but rather reaching out what is to come. In the presence of the truth, which is who you really are, we were exploring the question of what the eternal life of the saints would be like, which eye has not seen, nor ear heard, has it entered into the human heart. We opened wide the mouth of our heart to drink deeply of the heavenly waters of your pure spring, the well of life which abides with you. Then we were sprinkled to the limit of our poor ability and thus began to reflect widely on this great matter. So like, from what I understand in the ancient world, you had to be like a kind of philosophical mystic to have this sort of vision or mystical experience. And so in a way, he's kind of establishing himself as like a kind of true mystical philosopher for himself having this vision. But then here you have his uneducated, I mean, she's proven herself to be a bit philosophical in the Cassiacum community in the dialogue, so she's got it, and then she's a woman, and bang, they have this, and it's a shared religious experience, which is really interesting. And it's not like some nebulous union with the one as in Neoplatonism, but it's actually like they're engaging with the truth himself, which he says is you, God, like Christ, so very powerful. And then like his whole discussion of his lament for his mom's death, it's for me, it's like my mom, I was home in Canada for 2 months in the summer. My mom's very struggling with dementia. And now I'm starting to think of my mom, end of life care. And my mom was, solid Christian woman. And it's just been sad. And so I could kind of identify a little bit here with Augustine as he was like, he's talking about trying not to mourn his mom's loss. He's so human here, right? He's trying to be a philosopher and have his mind control his desires and affections. And yet he can't not cry for his mom, which I think is totally appropriate. It was a kind of Christian tradition where you shouldn't lament the death of the Christian.
He even says like people were like, "Why don't you have any emotion?" But then he explains he's actually trying to hold back the torrent of sadness.
Yeah. And she was 56, he was 33. Interesting year, for himself at 33.
So it's a Jesus type year.
When Christ is to have died on the cross at age 33. His son is there, so like so it's awesome for Monica. She gets to witness the baptism of her son and her grandson. He's a young boy. He's crying. Augustine's trying to like be more mature, but has a hard time with it. Again, the Psalms come up again as they use the Psalms to comfort themselves.
They chant a psalm,
yeah. The only thing she wants for her memory is that like he remembers her at the altar of the sacrament. Because that's where she basically lived, is what he's saying here. She's there all the time. He quotes Ambrose's hymn, which is another comfort for him as well. And then where is it here? Where he talks this is the one place right at the very end in section 37, the very last paragraph, where he says, inspire, O my Lord, my God, your servants, my brothers, and your sons who are my masters. For I serve them with my heart and voice and writings, inspire them whenever they read my confessions, to remember at your altar your servant Monica and her sometime husband Patricius. Though through their flesh you brought me into this life, how I do not know. Let them also remember with dutiful love those who in this transitory light were my parents, but who before you as Father and in our mother the Church were my brothers and my fellow citizens in the everlasting Jerusalem. for which your people on their earthly pilgrimage are sighing from the moment of their departure until they return. So may her last request to me be fulfilled for her more abundantly through many people's prayers, prompted by my confessions and by my prayers alone. So she's asked to be remembered at the sacrament, altar of the sacrament. And he's asking us to do that. Like, please remember my mother. And what a cool way to end the book, you know? And it's the only place where he actually names her is right here. He never refers to her directly by her name. And then he calls her his sister. She's his mother. But within his family, where you've got God the Father and the Mother of the Church, now Patricius and Monica are his siblings. So cool.
Well, it's interesting. There's 4 books left, and this is the end of like the normal sense of the story, but it's really the beginning of his life. His mother gave him natural birth, and now he has new birth, and she sees him off through this new birth into his, the career that we know of him, right? He becomes a well-known pastor, writer. I think he's probably the most well-known theologian of all time. That's 100%. Probably true.
After Paul, for sure.
Well,
it's him and Aquinas. Yeah, it's him and Aquinas. But Aquinas has his dominance within like
the Roman church
life.
Yeah.
Whereas Augustine transcends all that. Like, you think of like Derrida is very, interested in Augustine, like non-Christians, Albert Camus. You've even got like the French actor Gerard Depardieu, who was like a total profligate. Like, the guy actually did a reading tour, just go around and just read confessions out loud, and people would come to hear him.
He's a brilliant writer, thinker. You can feel his feelings. Aquinas is brilliant, but you don't.
Yeah.
Not like this. It's different.
Yeah, Augustine's influence is huge. I like, how you made that connection too, like with Monica bringing him into the world and stuff. Like what he says here too, like in a way, almost like justifying his tears for her death. It's like, she wept over me in my death until I became alive. And now and that's his spiritual death. Now he's weeping for her in her physical death, even though she's alive and will be alive in the resurrection. So cool connections there. I think he actually ties her tears to like the font of baptism or something. So.
Interesting. Well, I'm excited. The next 4 books I'm actually weirdly excited for, because I've read through them, but it'd be fun to like just kind of pause for a minute and think about what
we'll get my buddy Caleb to help us think through it too.
Yeah, we'll have to like pull some experts in to figure out our memory.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see you next time.
Cheers.